Happy Tuesday and welcome to Madeline's Life Management. Today I am in the middle of a move, but more importantly, I'm going to be talking about books and how they've changed my life. I read Perpetua and it was so good. One of my aunts recommended it to me. And you're reading it, and Perpetua, as many of you know, was a martyr, and she does die in the end, of course, but it's also a love story. It's really good. And as you're reading, you end up ending the book with no fear in death. While reading The Last Sin Eater, you also learn, a lot of people want to go into communities and say, this is what you're doing wrong, this is how you should be doing it. But it really taught me, that to not go in and try to fix communities, but rather find the good that they already have there. So people need communities. People thrive in communities. And so when you go into an area that doesn't do things the same way as you, try to build on what they already have, build on their strengths that are already there. And I think this has taken us as people a really long time to learn. And that's, what we see as the ideal isn't always everyone else's ideal. And so sometimes you really have to help a community or a group of people go in and figure out what's important to them. What did they want to see happening? What did they love about their community, and build on that. While reading The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, I had this epiphany that what you spend your time on, what you spend your money on, what you spend your resources on, that's where your heart is. That's who you are. Where your resources are going, those are your priorities. And do they align with what you wish them to be? While reading the Night Angel trilogy, it's a very harsh trilogy. One thing I realized was that things were only as harsh and sad as you wrote them to be. I was reading this book and you'd read these horrendous things and they'd devote one sentence to it, and then the character would move on to something else. And it dawned on me that in my experience as well, it can be that. If something bad happens, I can give that one sentence and then I can move on to the wonderful things in life and write chapters on it. And it just really changed how I reacted to situations in my life. Something would happen and I'd say, okay, I choose to give that one sentence in my book. And something good would happen, and I was like, you know what? I will fixate on this. While reading Bitter Blue, there's a very prominent character who has antisocial personality disorder, and he can talk and people believe everything he says. And while reading it, it just really made me aware of things in my life that I just believed. And it made me question everything, people's motives and thoughts and processes, because we are kind of pre-programmed to believe people, to trust people. And while reading that book, it involved a small child. I worked with Friendship Home in college for 3 years, and I worked with Cedars for one of those years. And when working with children, I learned that if something doesn't sound right, if something sounds fishy, you have to question that. I'd rather call Child Protective Services than look back and say, wow, I could have stopped that. While reading Bitter Blue is the name of the little girl. It's such an interesting transformation because you go through, it's a long series. In the first 2 books, you think of this king as generous and wonderful and loved by his people. And then the 3rd book, it's by Bitter Blue's perspective. And you really, it's a shock to the reader as well, because you feel like one of the townspeople that believe. I'm working with children. They're my priority. I don't care if you come in with a suit on and you look like you're very prominent, lawyer, whatever it may be. I'm going to question, odd markings. I'm going to question, trauma and this, that, and the other. I'm going to question if their play is more mature than it should be, because I want to be that person that in the book believed Bitter Blue above this king that they thought was righteous. In high school, I read 1984, and it wasn't assigned reading, but my mom and dad both loved the book. And so I read it, and I remember having a conversation with my dad after, and we talked about how, there are privacy options. It's so ironic that I'm doing this and I'm also making a vlog that is public, just out there in the world, but I'm also in control of that. And, you know, on Facebook, on Instagram, on other social media sites, on, you know, in other areas of our life, there are privacy options, but we don't believe, it's like we think we have pseudo voice, which is where someone asks for your opinion, you give your opinion and they disregard it. That's called pseudo voice. And you know, we feel like you know, they're giving us this privacy option, but it doesn't really matter what we say, so we don't do anything about it. And the truth of the matter is, privacy is an option. We just think that it's not because there's so many cameras in our world, there's so much media, and we're putting ourselves out there. So 1984 really made me cognizant of what people were listening and why, and different ways that I could combat, you know, this feeling of exposure in my everyday life so that I don't become desensitized to it, so that I note it and I can be diligent in keeping those things private that should be, and really having a choice in what people know and what people don't. I want to end with a Clockwork Orange. In the psychology field, you know, we're always kind of looking for ways to induce responses. You know, there's Pavlov's dog. It was so eye-opening for me to read the book as someone who is thinking inventively about different therapies that we could use, and it was, what they were doing was so real to some of the practices. I was really into cognitive behavioral therapy. I still am. But it was really, it mirrored some of those practices that we're doing today. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next Tuesday.